Hello everybody. A few weeks ago I worked my way through a live reaction to Philosophy Tube complaining about the process of receiving trans healthcare in the UK. I will be using the term trans healthcare in this video for the sake of speaking clearly, but I understand that some legitimate criticisms could be made of characterizing the biological sex-denying intervention going on in gender identity clinics as healthcare. But I'm not aware of a concise alternative term that would make it clear what I'm talking about. The purpose of this video will be to explain what problems I had with Philosophy Tube's video, so that if you enjoyed it, you can maybe appreciate why I personally didn't. I will start off by saying one thing I liked about the video, which is when Philosophy Tube very cringily demands that viewers give on Patreon.
Patreon.com/philosophytube. I am no longer asking, sign the up!
I like this because it makes me seem far more reasonable by comparison when I politely remind you that you can give on Patreon. It is very appreciated and does help me to make these videos. One note before starting, I frequently repeat that I think far and away the main question that matters when talking about trans identity is it an accurate claim about reality? Obviously, all identities are claims about reality, so I think the singular most important question regarding trans identity is whether it is accurate. When a biological male self-identifies as a woman, is this a true statement? Obviously, Philosophy Tube in this video is talking about secondary issues, so I have to admit up front that I consider the bulk of Philosophy Tube's points in this video to not be that important or interesting. I don't think this is a problem, because not every video I make has to deal with the most important topics, but it's just something to bear in mind before you dedicate your time to this video on the assumption that this is a very important debate. If you decide to stick around for the pure joy of me roasting Philosophy Tube, then I hope I don't disappoint. Please enjoy. If we're talking about dissatisfaction with the NHS in the UK, the elephant in the room right out the gate is that the NHS is underfunded. Throughout the video, Philosophy Tube repeats the fact that people in the UK have a right to medical treatment within 18 weeks of referral.
We also have the right to begin treatment within 18 weeks of referral.
And every single time it just comes across as really ridiculous and kind of petulant.
Having waited much longer than the legal maximum waiting time.
Because you having a right to something doesn't magically create resources and labor to provide healthcare.
I couldn't understand it. We have the right to be seen within 18 weeks.
You're angrily telling the NHS that they're violating your human rights because they're refusing to provide something that underfunding causes them to be literally incapable of providing. Now, I'm not PragerU or some stupid economically conservative channel. I understand that declaring things like water and housing and education and healthcare to be human rights is a very noble goal. But criticizing the NHS for not having enough funding to meet your rights to healthcare is like getting angry at an empty well for not meeting your human right to water. These problems are much broader in scope. We can't criticize the NHS for not having money. Instead, we should criticize the wider socioeconomic conditions that have led to the NHS being underfunded. That healthcare should be a human right is a valid reason to get angry at the current Conservative Party, austerity, neoliberalism, or capitalism, depending on how far you want to go in your dissatisfaction with the current system. But the NHS isn't in charge of how much money they get. So once you get down to that level, the harm is already done, and the NHS can't magic money out of nowhere. My personal take, for what it's worth, is that the central issue is governments often reduce the quality of public services in order to curb government expenditure in light of reduced government revenue. I believe that the quality of public services should determine the amount of government revenue, rather than the amount of government revenue determining the quality of public services. I'd love the NHS to not be in crisis, but it is. And Philosophy Tube appears to accept that the NHS is indeed in crisis.
That sucks. But what do you expect? The NHS is in crisis.
In fact, Philosophy Tube seems to recognize that problems with the way governments handle serious issues are ubiquitous.
Because this sort of thing's happening all over. We've known that climate change is a problem for ages. We know what we have to do to stop it, but we keep doing things that we know won't work.
So, yeah, the NHS is bad. That's not really news. What's the point of the video? Philosophy Tube at one point suggests that one of the people being complained to was unreasonable to feel that he was being called out directly by Philosophy Tube's complaints.
He took my complaints about the failures of the system as an attack on his character.
I don't know why this video was thought of as a good opportunity to gaslight this poor guy. Throughout the video, Philosophy Tube is constantly blaming the people in the NHS for the inefficiencies on display in a way that consistently comes across as a personal attack. In fact, Philosophy Tube literally within a few seconds goes on to say that the man being complained to in this instance is personally responsible for the failures in the NHS.
Rather than the failures that he's responsible for and how he's going to fix them.
Earlier on in the video, Philosophy Tube also, via a Catch-22 reference, seems to imply that this same person has the ability to magic resources into the hands of the NHS.
I'll call him Major Major.
You're major, 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 major. You can just sign things.
So the way that Philosophy Tube presents things, this major guy is personally responsible for all these issues and has the ability as major to do something to fix the situation. So this guy is being blamed unambiguously for the issues. The buck is viewed by Philosophy Tube to be stopping at him, but also he's being unreasonable if he feels under attack. As a final point on the basic inefficiencies of the NHS, Philosophy Tube presents some actual philosophy in this video that basically argues that institutions seek to reduce the diversity of requests so that they're better able to meet them.
The drive to reduce variety, Beer says, is like gravity or entropy. He actually calls it a natural law.
This is a potentially interesting claim, but within the context of the video, I'm not really sure what the point of it is. Philosophy Tube doesn't come to any conclusions using this as an insight. It sort of just comes across like Philosophy Tube realized it might be good to include some philosophy in this feature-length YouTube video, and then didn't bother to actually incorporate that philosophy into a wider point. Have I mentioned before that just in general, Philosophy Tube isn't a very good philosophy channel? Because yeah, that's a thing. With the NHS in the state it's in, is there any good argument for turning these issues with receiving trans healthcare into a trans rights issue, rather than just an extension of much broader issues with funding for public services? Philosophy Tube does make reference to several reports which apparently show anti-trans bigotry is a major reason for trans healthcare issues.
Also in 2015, the Women and Equality Select Committee issued a report on the state of trans healthcare, which again identified prejudice as a major obstacle.
Unfortunately, these studies aren't elaborated on at all. I mean, the video is only an hour and a half to be fair, so there just wasn't time. I'm sure this isn't just a case of dropping a load of politically motivated studies of little substance in lieu of having any actual argument. I mean, the way that Philosophy Tube just describes prejudice as a major obstacle is so ambiguous as to be functionally saying nothing. The real question is whether or not discrimination is a major contributor to issues with accessing trans healthcare, because the alternative is that it's very minor and Philosophy Tube is just complaining about the underfunded National Health Service in the UK that everybody has to deal with. By the way, disabuse yourself of any anticipation that I will be going through these reports myself. Philosophy Tube gets a 6-figure salary to drop a video every month or so.
I am no longer asking, sign the f*** up!
And can't be bothered to actually present the information in these reports in a cogent manner. I make considerably less than a living wage, uploading far more regularly, so I really don't have time to do Philosophy Tube's job of actually truffling out a substantial argument from these reports. Philosophy Tube also implies that high instances of maternal mortality amongst black women is due to discrimination.
Well, black women are 4 times as likely to die in childbirth than white women.
I find it very hard to believe that medical professionals just not liking black women is a major contributor to that increased mortality. Again, the problem here is wider, socio-economic factors relating to racial inequality more generally. PhilosophyTube hasn't come close to meeting the burden of proof for suggesting that discrimination is the main factor above underfunding for why the NHS fails many of the people who rely on it. However, PhilosophyTube does seemingly try to evidence this idea that discrimination is the problem with an anecdote about one particular GP who was apparently quite a roadblock in seeking out trans healthcare. In short, the GP said that PhilosophyTube should wait 1 month before the GP would write a referral letter for a gender identity clinic.
So the idea that you're supposed to wait a month before you can go, she made that up.
The thing is, GPs are allowed to make stuff up. They are general practitioners, and thus it's their job to decide what's the appropriate course of action. As somebody with health anxiety, I've often been told by GPs to wait certain amounts of time before an issue might be progressed, with the logic being that maybe my initial complaint would go away. I've always assumed these times are arbitrary and based on the GP's sense of what might be a reasonable time to wait to see how a complaint develops. Throughout the rest of the video, PhilosophyTube insists that trans healthcare should be basically the same as any other form of healthcare, but apparently this is the exception. Unlike with any other complaint, it's completely unacceptable that PhilosophyTube be told to wait any amount of time for a referral. Honestly, things get pretty crazy from here on out. PhilosophyTube speculates that the GP failing to send a letter must have been the GP intentionally sabotaging the progression of treatment.
My doctor was either so incompetent she couldn't work a postbox, or more likely, she didn't want to give me medical care.
That's a really cruel insult to be directing at somebody who is incredibly overworked within an incredibly underfunded system. PhilosophyTube says,
My GP didn't refuse to help me because they didn't have the money. It would have cost her nothing to actually do her job.
But it's as if PhilosophyTube isn't aware that GPs are cognizant of their place within a wider system. Yeah, it doesn't cost the GP individually anything to progress somebody's healthcare complaint, but it does cost the system as a whole, which is why GPs don't just progress every single healthcare complaint automatically, because they aren't so self-centered as to have no concerns beyond themselves. Meanwhile, PhilosophyTube is honestly so demanding as to come across as a really unpleasant person.
She only had one job: send me to the gender clinic.
I feel like this is a prime example of how not to regard your fellow human beings. GPs are usually accepting very low wages to try to be part of an underfunded system where they're, at least for now, trying to keep the aspiration alive of being able to provide healthcare for everybody. Not just you, PhilosophyTube. Everybody. The G in GP doesn't stand for genie. They aren't in bondage to you and obligated to dutifully deliver your every wish. While I'm expressing my objection to PhilosophyTube's overall character, I just want to mention that PhilosophyTube ends this video with a very self-congratulatory mention that a play written by PhilosophyTube won a bunch of awards.
Because it turns out when we're actually allowed to tell our own stories for a change, they're pretty good.
I just can't help but think that PhilosophyTube might be a bit of a narcissist. And the funny thing is that in the end, this video contains an admission that there is nothing to support the idea that GPs are the ones hurting the system.
There's nothing in here to support Cathcart's claim that GPs are the ones standing in the way of changing the system.
So this entire section on GPs tells us nothing about why the NHS is plagued with issues, and the only thing we've learned are some unsavory things about PhilosophyTube's character. The thing is, that's it. Apart from this, PhilosophyTube makes no real arguments for the claim that issues in accessing trans healthcare are due to anti-trans discrimination. But before we say that therefore it's just a matter of underfunding, PhilosophyTube does argue this isn't the only concern.
It is a fact that the NHS admits not all the problems are caused by a lack of funding.
The other issue is just general institutional inefficiency. I don't think anybody is claiming that the NHS or any government service could not possibly be doing more with the money they have. But the reality is that the NHS is a huge organisation, and therefore you sort of just have to accept this loss of money from inefficiency as a fact of life. This is why administrators exist to run huge bureaucracies. which I hope Philosophy Tube understands, despite almost at one point seeming to imply that it's bad that the NHS isn't administered by doctors.
He's not a doctor, and actually that's worth bearing in mind. The NHS is not administered by doctors, it's administered by administrators.
Philosophy Tube's basic point is that if you get rid of safeguards and bureaucracy and just let trans-identified people do whatever they want, then that would save the NHS money.
If they just gave us healthcare the same way cis people get, the way other countries do, the way we've been asking for years, it would genuinely save the NHS a lot of cash.
And I don't think anybody's denying that, but maybe safeguarding is a good thing. More on that in just a minute. Philosophy Tube makes a big deal about how an informed consent system would be a lot better.
If the NHS just gave us an informed consent healthcare system, it would save them a whole lot of money and time and produce better healthcare outcomes for everyone who uses it.
The thing is, the specifics of this supposedly much better system are never explained. You know, it was, again, only an hour-and-a-half long video from Philosophy Tube, so I guess there just wasn't time to explain the specifics of a new system that might actually solve things. It almost seems like this system wouldn't actually be that good, and that's why we're not getting any explanation of specifics. Instead, it's just being presented so Philosophy Tube can continue to argue that the issues with the NHS are there by design, so that trans activists can continue playing the victim. And I don't think I'm wrong to suggest that Philosophy Tube is more interested in playing the victim than in finding actual solutions, considering that Philosophy Tube actually presents being forward-minded and more concerned with making progress than dwelling on mistakes of the past as a bad thing.
But in all my conversations with NHS senior officers, they only want to look forwards. They don't want to look back at the warnings they were given, at the promises they made.
Indeed, despite all the problems, apparently, with the system, Philosophy Tube actually describes being most upset with the absence of an apology or accountability for how the NHS has been so evil and transphobic.
This is the bit that really gets me. He wants us to just forget about all the horrible things that have happened.
This to me confirms that Philosophy Tube is entirely more interested in playing the victim than in working towards solutions, which also suggests that there never really was a problem in the first place. On a final point regarding solutions, Philosophy Tube suggests that often official documents about solving issues can be counterproductive, the logic being that saying you're going to do something is often a good substitute for actually doing it.
You end up doing the document rather than doing the doing. Furthermore, the orientation toward writing good documents can block action insofar as the document then gets taken up as evidence that we have done it.
This is interesting to me because the focus on words over material reality is precisely one of the things I'm objecting to when I oppose trans identity. This tendency to focus on saying the right things rather than actually helping people stems from the neoliberal idealism that is responsible for trans activism. But of course, the other reason I find this ironic is that how is this not exactly what Philosophy Tube is doing in this video? Okay, so let's talk about safeguarding. I'm honestly not sure how concerned Philosophy Tube is about safety, considering that apparently death is a civil right.
It also impacts our access to civil rights like marriage, death, and privacy.
So who knows, maybe the increased risk of adverse side effects from taking wrong sex hormones is actually part of Philosophy Tube's civil rights crusade. Seriously though, Philosophy Tube makes a joke about the serious effects of abusing testosterone.
The government doesn't want trans guys getting too yoked. Rishi Sunak's a short king. He doesn't want to be intimidated by all these trans dudes walking around getting buff.
Honestly, abusing strength-enhancing substances is a really serious issue that leads to all sorts of the most serious health issues. I don't really want to look them up or list them because I do have health anxiety, so I don't really allow myself to Google around these topics too much, but I can recommend a very informative video on the topic.
Raised blood pressure, enlarged organs, increased chance of heart attack over time, hair growth, reproductive problems, liver damage, high cholesterol, acne, sterilization, cardiovascular problems, kidney problems, excessive sweating, risk of HIV and Hep B, Hep C from needles, increased risk of psychosis, aching joints, insomnia, depression, yada yada yada. As you can see, it's pretty neck and neck.
But obviously, one reason people abuse testosterone is because they want to be physically stronger and show how big and manly they are. So it's probably not a good idea to make fun of the people trying to regulate strength-enhancing substances and imply that they just don't want you to be strong. Also, while we're at it, it's kind of problematic to attack the masculinity of Asian men. That's attached to a lot of negative racial stereotyping, which I wouldn't want to be a part of. But apparently, PhilosophyTube doesn't think it's a problem to take wrong sex hormones, because that pales in comparison to the immeasurable harm of going through the wrong puberty.
And you're forced to go through the wrong puberty. It can be very distressing.
You know, the wrong puberty. Like when you're biologically male and then you go through male puberty. I can't think of anything that could be worse than going through the wrong puberty, except for maybe telling young children that there is something wrong with their bodies and telling them that the way their bodies are changing is wrong. PhilosophyTube seems to have some pretty unreasonable expectations when it comes to healthcare. Apparently, it's bad that people have to be diagnosed with something before receiving healthcare.
But it also codified the idea that we need to be diagnosed with something first.
As if that isn't standard practice. On a related note, PhilosophyTube also responds indignantly to the fact that a mental health diagnosis involves being asked questions.
This person, who has the power to decide what the rest of your life will look like, asks you questions to make sure that your answers fit the ones they have in their textbook.
The first objection to this seems to be that asking questions is obviously a bad way to ascertain somebody's mental health, but isn't that just how we diagnose any mental health issue? PhilosophyTube presents it in this incredibly reductionist way to make it seem super unreasonable. This doctor who doesn't know you just asks you questions and uses some arbitrary list of approved answers to determine whether you get healthcare? How ridiculous is that? But what is actually being described here is that a professional has a conversation with you where they ask you probing questions and use their specialist knowledge to make a broad judgment about the state of your mental health. Again, this is just a standard practice and probably the only effective way to diagnose mental health issues. I'll reiterate that PhilosophyTube mostly insists that trans healthcare should be treated like any other kind of healthcare, but there are some notable exceptions. However, let's talk about the apparent inconsistencies where trans healthcare is treated differently from other healthcare in a way that is unfair. This is pretty much entirely centered around the issue of safeguarding, to what extent different issues require medical intervention. As such, I'll divide PhilosophyTube's objections into two categories. The first are non-trans healthcare issues where people can get some sort of treatment more easily than they should be able to. For example, men can get testosterone blockers to avoid going bald if they want.
If a cisgender man is worried about going bald, he can get testosterone blockers from his GP.
And also, nose jobs have a high regret rate, but apparently there's no real safeguarding around that.
Another example, nose jobs. No psych evaluations there.
Now obviously, these issues aren't the exact same as trans healthcare, but they're pretty similar, so why should they be treated differently? And my honest opinion is that they shouldn't be. We need more safeguarding around these issues. I think that anybody undergoing any form of cosmetic surgery should have to go through a period of mental health treatment, because my firm belief is that if somebody's own discomfort with how they look is to be regarded as a medical issue, then it should first and foremost be regarded as one relating to mental health. So I think that PhilosophyTube is right to object to this inconsistency. So in that sense, this is PhilosophyTube's first and only W of this video. However, I don't agree with the suggestion that we should make the safeguarding for trans healthcare as lax as for typical cosmetic surgery. Rather, I would say that we should make cosmetic surgery have more safeguarding, because anybody being uncomfortable with how they look and feeling the need to change how they look through medical treatment is a serious issue in my view. So PhilosophyTube's ultimate point is that accessing trans healthcare involves jumping through a lot more hoops than accessing other healthcare.
Then be diagnosed with gender dysphoria, then be on hormone replacement therapy for a certain amount of time, and then she needs 2 separate psychiatric assessments.
Now, when there are other forms of healthcare similar to trans identity that are centered largely around addressing somebody's irrational discomfort with their own body, I would support having just as many safeguards as exist for trans healthcare. However, there are some instances where I think we don't need as many safeguards as trans healthcare, and these are instances where the healthcare being provided isn't about addressing somebody's irrational discomfort with their own body. In such instances, the provision of this healthcare is about addressing an undeniable physical ailment.
A cisgender woman with chronic uterine bleeding who wants a hysterectomy, that's a removal of the womb, can be referred to a surgeon from her GP.
Now, I can't go through every single instance where different medical treatments are treated differently. These treatments are complicated, and the precise nature of the distinctions between them in terms of medical necessity is highly nuanced. It is this complexity and nuance, though, that means you can't just say, well, these two treatments are similar, therefore it's completely unreasonable that they're treated differently. Because those differences that make the two treatments similar rather than identical might be the differences that justify them being treated differently. Therefore, the broad response to Philosophy Tube's broad objection is different medical issues are treated differently, obviously. I'll take this opportunity to remind everybody that it's not irrelevant to the question of trans healthcare what precisely trans healthcare is. Is it accommodating a delusion, or is it reflecting a reality? Might the current demand for trans healthcare be considerably lower if there was an open, honest dialogue where it was more socially acceptable to criticize the spurious premise that it's even possible for biological males to be women? All this time we're discussing trans healthcare, and yet any intelligent, critically minded person should be wondering, why do we need to use surgery and drugs to make biological males look more like biological females in the first place? Why should we call such a thing healthcare? Would it also be healthcare to make black people look like white people? Is that healthcare? The thing is, Philosophy Tube claims not only that it's possible for a biological male to become a woman, but even that it's possible for a biological male to change sex altogether and presumably become a biological female.
If you want to change sex, it's possible.
The good news is, at least we know which side of the roughly equal split Philosophy Tube is on within trans activism between the half of them who are insisting that nobody is saying you can change biological sex, and the idea that anybody is saying you can change biological sex is actively misrepresenting the situation, and the other half who are emphatically saying you can change sex. Now, Philosophy Tube doesn't defend the claim that biological males can change sex, but I just want to clarify that indeed the claim is indefensible. I am a biological male. There is nothing I can do to change that. The reason for this is that biological sex is determined by the gamete size that the phenotype is organized around facilitating the function of in sexual reproduction. The phenotype is the anatomical expression of the genotype. So having dark skin is a phenotypical expression of the genotype of most people from sub-Saharan Africa, but applying fake tan isn't part of a Northwest European's phenotype because it's not as a result of their genotype. Likewise, surgically altering your male genitalia such that it forms a hole rather than a phallus isn't an expression of your genotype, although it may be an expression of your gross misogyny if you think that all that's necessary for something to be considered a vagina is being a hole. For the record, clownfish can actually change biological sex because their genes allow for this. Human genes don't allow for changes in sex. You can pump your body full of hormones and cut parts of your body off or open, but you can't change your genes. But after this, things get even weirder, because within a few seconds, Philosophy Tube goes from talking about biological sex,
If you want to change sex, it's possible.
to the categories of man and woman,
For all of human history, we've had this divide between men and women.
to masculinity and femininity.
Hold in one hand all of masculinity.
The way that Philosophy Tube jumps from talking about one thing to the other really comes across as if these things are being viewed as interchangeable. Philosophy Tube brings up the categories of man and woman immediately after mentioning biological sex.
If you want to change sex, it's possible. For all of human history, we've had this divide between men and women. But if you want to cross that divide,
For the record, so immediately that when I wrote down the timestamps for that comment, I wrote the same timestamp for the mention of biological sex and the categories of man and woman, down to the second. The video goes from saying how it's possible to change sex to then discussing the divide between men and women. So I'm just going to take this as it immediately appears as being a recognition that biological sex is the appropriate referent for whether somebody should be considered a man or woman. I would also conflate changing sex with changing from being a man to a woman or vice versa. However, the difference is that Philosophy Tube apparently believes that changing sex is possible, so thus believes that changing from being a man to a woman is possible. The issue is that this is now either arguing for a transmedicalist stance, that medical transition changes sex and thus changes somebody from being a man to a woman, or else Philosophy Tube would have to be arguing that medical intervention isn't even necessary to change sex. See, these are the problems when you just casually conflate changing sex with changing from being a man to a woman without thinking about the implications of what you're saying. Speaking of problematically conflating things, Philosophy Tube then of course mentions masculinity.
But if you want to cross that divide, if you want to transcend it entirely and be neither, it's possible. In particular, hold in one hand all of masculinity.
The issue is that Philosophy Tube jumps from these different categories without any indication of talking about a new thing. Philosophy Tube didn't say, I'm done talking about biological sex, now let's talk about the categories of man and woman, and now Philosophy Tube has just thrown masculinity into the mix without any indication of changing subject. So it seems like Philosophy Tube is now conflating masculinity with manhood. And bearing in mind that Philosophy Tube also conflates being biologically male with manhood, how about that for some biological essentialism? Of course, this is incredibly wrong-headed and entirely anti-feminist. And it gets worse because Philosophy Tube then seems to imply that trans identity is necessary to overcome the constraints of traditional masculinity.
But when you're a trans woman, you can take all of that and just...
This is a common criticism that gender criticals make against trans identity. In the gender critical stance, being a man or woman shouldn't come attached to any gendered expectations relating to masculinity. The criticism that gender criticals make of trans identity is that they often seem to believe that actually the only way for a woman to escape traditional femininity is to become a man, which is utterly contrary to women's empowerment. What's crazy though is seeing this claim made by Philosophy Tube so unambiguously.
Hold in one hand all of masculinity. But when you're a trans woman, you can take all of that and just...
So that's a conditional. If that's the case, then you can blow away masculinity and the patriarchal expectations attached to that. Meanwhile, the gender-critical feminist stance is, whoever you are, you don't need to be constrained by gendered expectations. There's no if you're trans condition at all. This is honestly the biggest mask-off moment possibly ever in the history of my channel. This is a major trans activist channel with 1 million subscribers just admitting that, yeah, trans identity is the only viable way for a man to escape the constraints of masculinity. An utterly anti-feminist message. And is there a big backlash from the trans community? Did they call out this statement? No, because deep down that's what they believe. They are utterly patriarchal in their mindset, and deep down they believe women are supposed to be feminine and men are supposed to be masculine, and that's why they say you can reject masculinity if you're a trans woman, if you change your sex so that you're in the correct category for a feminine person. And within this context, it's especially insidious to be pushing for a reduction in safeguarding and hurdles standing in the way of medical transition. Imagine you're a boy who is uncomfortable with the expectations of traditional masculinity. You then watch this video by Philosophy Tube saying that you can get rid of all of those expectations if you become trans. And in this same video, Philosophy Tube appears to conflate being trans with undergoing medical transition and argues that there should be fewer questions asked when children want to undergo medical transition. It is very clear that Philosophy Tube thinks gender non-conforming children should be sterilized, and Philosophy Tube will basically admit as much in a video watched by over 1 million people, and yet there is no objection from the trans activist community. That tells you everything you need to know about the two sides in this debate. Philosophy Tube does mention the idea that maybe trans-identified people will play up their enthusiasm for gendered stereotypes as a way to make their claims of dysphoria seem more credible when they're seeking out trans healthcare.
Yeah, I wore my mother's dress. I called myself Wendy. Like, all I want is to be a 1950s housewife and marry a man. Of course you're going to say that!
I'm not sure if this is supposed to be understood as a response to the criticism that trans identity tends to entrench traditional masculinity and femininity, but if it is, then it isn't a very good one. Trans activists play up traditional masculinity and femininity as important parts of their identity all the time, entirely independent of seeking a medical diagnosis. And I shouldn't even need to make that point because we just saw Philosophy Tube do that exact thing in this very video. Their conflation of masculinity with manhood and femininity with womanhood isn't a mask they're putting on to appease the medical establishment, it's their sincerely held belief that is most visible when the mask slips. A few closing related points on this topic. Philosophy Tube says via a source that trans identity challenges patriarchy because it contradicts patriarchy that men would choose to be women if men are supposedly better.
There is no greater threat than the existence of trans women, who despite being born male and inheriting male privilege, choose to be female instead. By embracing our own femaleness and femininity, we in a sense cast a shadow of doubt over the supposed supremacy of maleness and masculinity.
This is an awful point simply because it cuts both ways. An anti-feminist could just as credibly argue that trans identity contradicts feminism because it contradicts the idea that men are privileged and women are oppressed if men would choose to be women. But more generally, this is a completely wrong-headed understanding of patriarchy. Patriarchy demands masculinity of men, and therefore, the idea of men who aren't masculine trying to become women in the way that Philosophy Tube advocates for would be directly facilitating the continuation of patriarchy. What challenges patriarchy more, indeed what is the only way to challenge patriarchy, would be men and women understanding themselves as men and women completely independent of social roles and expectations, and only with reference towards biological reality. That's how you oppose patriarchy. Finally, let's talk about whether or not everybody has gender dysphoria. I'll start off with a positive and say that Philosophy Tube points out that gender dysphoria isn't its own thing, but rather a collection of all sorts of other negative emotions around one's own body.
I don't think it is an extra feeling. I think it's just the sum of...
This is certainly true. Philosophy Tube then tries to argue that because cis people experience all of these negative feelings too, it therefore follows that cis people have gender dysphoria.
And cis people also feel all those feelings.
This is obviously nonsense. Philosophy Tube offers up a thought experiment of a man who wants to see a university, and he gets shown several different locations in the university, but insists he hasn't been shown the university itself.
Tells a story about a guy who goes to Oxford and asks to see the university. And they show him the colleges and the libraries and the quads. And at the end of the day he says, yes, but where's the university? You haven't shown me that.
This thought experiment is supposed to be illustrating what a category error is.
What philosophers call a category error.
Which I'm not sure it actually does. A category error is a different thing. But as I may have mentioned before, Philosophy Tube doesn't actually know very much about philosophy. I suspect the term category error was thrown in just because it sounds smart, but it just isn't a very relevant concept. Thing is, this thought experiment actually shows why Philosophy Tube is wrong, because obviously in this analogy the university is a stand-in for gender dysphoria, and the various locations of the university are a stand-in for the negative feelings that constitute gender dysphoria. Philosophy Tube is arguing that because these negative feelings are present in basically everybody, it therefore follows that basically everybody has gender dysphoria. But this would be like concluding that because assembly halls and canteens and classrooms and libraries are present in basically every educational establishment, it therefore follows that basically every educational establishment is a university. That is, of course, not true. Philosophy Tube asks why it isn't gender dysphoria if a woman is going through menopause and feels bad about it.
If a cisgender woman goes through menopause and thinks, oh, my body feels bloated, it doesn't feel like my own, I'm anxious and depressed, is that not gender dysphoria?
And appears to suggest more broadly that there is no reason to regard gender dysphoria as its own unique thing, distinct from having any other negative feelings about one's body.
That's body dysmorphia, not gender dysphoria. It is a different thing. But that's what I'm asking. Why is it different?
In reality, gender dysphoria can be quite easily defined. It's basically just the negative feelings, particularly anxiety and depression, one has about the reality of their own biological sex due to the belief that this biological sex is incongruent with a sense that they have that actually their body should be more like that of a typical member of the opposite sex. That's gender dysphoria. It seems like a perfectly useful term to have. It seems wholly obvious why this is different from a woman feeling distress at her body that she recognizes is the appropriate body for her going through menopause. I'm not wholly against the desire to broaden gender dysphoria beyond trans identity. Philosophy Tube argues that isn't it a bit like gender dysphoria when a man feels anxious about not being manly enough and tries to bring his body into line with a more idealized masculine form?
If a cis man is skinny and can't grow a beard and looks at his peers and thinks, oh, I should be manlier, is that not gender dysphoria?
The thing is, this conclusion actually lines up better with the gender-critical theorization of gender dysphoria. In gender-critical thought, gender dysphoria is recognized as extending from people's anxiety brought about by the pressures of living in an intensely gendered society. Therefore, the gender-critical argument is that we shouldn't shift the blame for these anxieties by saying that such people actually were born in the wrong bodies, but rather we should attack the root cause of the anxiety, which is the gendered expectations placed upon people in the first place. Philosophy Tube says it's bad that gender dysphoria is viewed simply as that thing trans people have.
And in that case, you might as well just call it mad disease.
And I would agree that we should recognize that many non-trans identified individuals struggle with gender dysphoria, because by doing so, we highlight that actually, feeling anxious or upset about your body is very normal, and it's not a good reason to start denying the reality of your own body or insist that your body is wrong. Therefore, it's good to point to the many people who are not trans-identified and who accept the reality of their biological sex even as they struggle with gender dysphoria. Especially, it's worth pointing to the innumerable success cases of people who actually feel much happier and healthier having confronted their anxieties about gender rather than trying to blame their own bodies for the negative feelings they felt in the past. I think that's a much better attitude to have than Philosophy Tube's insistence that we should just make it easier for people to change their bodies until they're satisfied that they have the right one. Philosophy Tube suggests that there is no way to know that gender dysphoria is real, apparently because diagnosing it is based on self-reporting.
There's no way of knowing whether gender dysphoria is a real diagnostic pattern or just a collective invention.
Which is such a weird thing to say, because by that logic, we can't know that anything relating to mental health or personal experience is real. It just seems like only a very limited view of epistemology could lead somebody to conclude that we can't possibly know that gender dysphoria is a thing. And then towards the end of the video, Philosophy Tube seems to express negative feelings towards trans-identified people who are invested in the idea that gender dysphoria exists.
There are some, not naming names, who say, I'm a real transsexual. I've been diagnosed with the mental illness that is gender dysphoria, not like all these genderqueer non-binary teenagers with their green hair and their Lucy and Yak dungarees.
I'm not going to get involved too much in the trans infighting, but I'll say that at least defining trans identity with reference to gender dysphoria means it has some kind of substantial definition. It's saying, I am a woman because I have negative feelings towards my biologically male body. Which isn't a good way of understanding being a woman, but it's at least a bit less circular than saying, I'm a woman because I say I'm a woman because I'm trans because I say I am and I say I am because I am a woman. I guess Philosophy Tube thinks that the latter reasoning is a better way of understanding trans identity, which really tells you everything you need to know about the veracity of trans identity. Okay, so this is the last section before the conclusion, but I just want to mention a few issues I had that weren't big enough to fit into their own sections. The very smallest criticism is that Philosophy Tube likens a regulatory organization that oversees the NHS to being like the military police.
Which I guess in this example would be like the military police. They're an independent body who is supposed to investigate the NHS when things go wrong.
But that isn't what the military police are. The military police don't oversee and regulate the military. They're usually part of the military, and their job is to maintain law and order in military communities, such as should be the job of the police in any community. Philosophy Tube also suggests that trans identity should be kept a secret because this helps to avoid discrimination from landlords.
Then every time you apply to rent a flat or get a job, you'll have to show them your passport, and they'll instantly know you're trans.
I find this comment a bit weird, and not just for the reason that for most trans-identified people, keeping their trans identity a secret is only possible behind their anime Twitter profiles and certainly not in person. But the other reason I find this weird is that it suggests a total disregard for the innumerable marginalized groups who simply can't keep their membership of that group secret. It's an incredibly self-serving attitude. Landlords discriminate, so I need to be able to keep the fact I'm trans a secret. Sorry to all the racial minorities who might face discrimination, you're on your own. The solution to discriminatory landlords is not to keep your membership of a marginalized demographic a secret, but to challenge discrimination systemically across society. PhilosophyTube concludes the video in an incredibly strange way.
Given that human beings can change sex, do you want to?
This is weird for a few reasons. Firstly, because, yeah, it's a pretty weird way to end. Secondly, because it has nothing to do with the rest of the video. This is supposed to be about discrimination faced in trying to access trans healthcare, and yet the ultimate conclusion is, hey, you want to be trans? Big groomer energy. And thirdly, because this is being presented as a supposed explanation for anti-trans discrimination, the idea being that people are anti-trans because they might secretly want to be trans themselves and are anxious about it. This is an incredibly problematic way of conceptualizing bigoted attitudes. It basically suggests that marginalized groups are responsible for the bigotry against themselves. I thought we were all over the lame idea that all homophobes are secretly gay, but apparently now all supposed transphobes are secretly trans. It's just a very harmful trope, and it's a shame to see somebody who's supposed to be advocating for trans-identified people tacitly endorsing that trope. Anyway, this is the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed, and that you might even be willing to express that with a like and a share and a subscribe and a comment to let me know what you think. Also, no pressure, but Patreon is very appreciated and does help me with making these videos. Thank you for watching and have a great weekend.